But the very fact you've got Gene Hackman, Ernest Borgnine, Shelley Winters, Roddy McDowall, Leslie Nielsen, there's just a who's who in
Mm.
this film that raises it from being a little bit of a schlocky 70s disaster film like The Towering Inferno or Airport,
Whoa, 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 whoa,
to,
whoa. Don't call those films schlocky. Come on. I mean, particularly
okay,
Towering
okay.
Inferno.
You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be.
So, Steve, very sad news recently, the passing of your great uncle, I assume,
Yes,
uh,
absolutely.
Gene Hackman. I mean, do you want to get into the actual the case, the story, what happened? It seems to be an incredibly sad story, what's going
Yeah,
on.
yeah. Let's start with that. But then I'm going to piggyback before we go into a little retrospective of his movies and the films that have maybe been meaningful to you and
Mm.
I. I do have a wonderful anecdote to share. That he's not my uncle, but I did have a connection at one small anecdote. It's quite funny. But yeah, let's talk about the case.
It's bizarre. I mean, he died. News came out that he had died,
Mhm.
and he was 95 years old. He had obviously retired back in 2004, and everybody knew that he had sort of advanced staged sort of Alzheimer's and all kinds of other things that were sort of prohibiting him from living an ordinary life. But when his sort of body was really stumbled upon, they found he was dead, his wife was dead, one of the dogs was dead, and there'd been no signs of forced entry, no signs of a gas leak or anything like that. And as the details come through, it seems almost like his wife, who was about 30 years younger than him, had died first. That she had contracted an illness and that she had died. She was obviously his primary caregiver, and that she may have died as much as a week before he did,
Yeah, and
suggesting that
apparently,
perhaps
yeah,
he was kind of
yeah.
just like left to
Apparently
to
his
perish.
Alzheimer's was so advanced that he might not even been aware that she was dead, and
Yeah.
he had no food in his stomach, so he had not been eating. This is just a tragic case, and there was an article today I read about how this really highlights Alzheimer's and what how it steals the identity and steals people away from us, and that I guess there was a TMZ article not too long ago where they snapped some tutorials. They caught Gene Hackman and his wife. It's one of the last pictures of him being out, and obviously very dazed. There's been a lot of criticism apparently of these pictures being published, but it's this great titan of the film industry who although he wasn't always characterized as a tough guy, I would consider him one of the tough guys in many ways. He always played very strong alpha male type
Mm.
roles, and yet in these pictures he's dazed. He seems out of it. He's got a little baseball cap, a shirt that doesn't quite fit him right, jeans that don't
Oh,
quite
he's
fit
so
him right.
thin. I've
It's just
seen that
frail,
footage.
yeah.
I
And
remember when
it's
it came out.
just
Yeah,
and this is not how he would want to be remembered. He
of
doesn't
course
quite
not.
know who he is. And so it's just all around this is tragic. You wonder why, there's some people whose bodies just refuse to die. He's
Mm.
95 years old. He probably should have passed away 5, 6 years ago. The mind is gone, but the body just refuses to die. And it's just all around, it's just a tragic case.
Yeah, I think that's quite possibly what happened. I mean, he wasn't your traditional kind of athletic tough guy, and he wasn't like one of these big sort of beefcakes, but he was just that kind of old school sort of Robert Mitchum, John
Yeah.
Wayne type of just, a brutish kind of, like you say, an alpha male, blue collar alpha male that
Yeah.
was, and he was kind of last of his breed. I was trying to think of somebody who's still around who's a bit like that. And the only person I can really think of is someone like Harrison Ford, maybe, is
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
that kind of guy. And even he was kind of, if you had asked me who's more in shape, I'd say your Harrison Ford is definitely more in shape than Gene
Right.
Hackman. But
Right.
back then, back in like the sort of 60s and 70s, it seems that just that kind of sort of bullheaded blue collar guy was your tough guy, like a James Caan or
Yeah.
somebody like that. And yeah, and he was, but he was like that right until the end. But like you say, it didn't necessarily dictate the kind of roles that he portrayed. And I think one of his great skills is that he was one of those, what you'd now call a character actor, who
Yeah.
managed to make that type of performance into a sort of a leading role. And so he had quite a
Yeah.
sort of quite a diverse range.
Yeah, he did. I mean, he could play Popeye Doyle in French Connection. He could play the strong priest pastor who was saving all those lives on the Poseidon Adventure. He was the Mississippi Burning, the FBI agent that was going to go head to head with the white supremacists on behalf of the tragic deaths of the young black activists. And then he could play the whiny little squirmy little movie executive from Get Shorty,
Yeah.
who is the opposite of the tough guy. I mean, he could just do the full range, and he was not it's not like he was an ugly guy by any stretch, but he was not a handsome, head turner. He was just he was the everyman who made it.
Yeah, no, exactly that. Yeah, he wasn't sort of your typical romantic lead, and so most of his roles aren't that.
Mm-mm.
Not to say that he didn't get the girl, but that was often not the focus of
No.
the show. But he would typically gravitate towards cops and military guys, particularly as he got older. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I didn't know. I was surprised to read. I did a bit of reading up on him, after he had passed, that he had been in the military. They had been in the Marines.
Yeah, he had. Yes.
He'd
Yeah.
been one of those kids who lied about his age. This is something I could never possibly understand. Kids who would lie about their age in order to be able to sign up for the military. I mean, call me a coward or whatever, but it's not something I would ever try and do or ever even sort of
I mean,
perceive.
it's such a different frame of mind because I mean, Jimmy Stewart went and fought in World War II. Like
Mm.
he did bombing missions, I believe. And there was that generation. You just couldn't picture Tom Cruise signing up and going fighting in Afghanistan. I mean, granted, Afghanistan is a different case than World War II, but you just don't see our cadre of actors today signing up for the military. Although I will give Adam Driver credit because I think he did fight in Afghanistan.
Yeah, he was definitely in the Marines, that's for sure.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
did lots of good work and started like a theatre troupe and things like that, which he's now carried on. Since he was discharged. Yeah, and
By
I
the way,
read that.
little side note here is this is zero beer. I'm on day 6 of my Lenten. I'm not drinking alcohol.
Well, this is water, so hey.
Oh, okay. There we go. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's fine. I mean, no, I was surprised to read that he had done served some of his time, if that's the right expression, in Shanghai. I think he had
Oh,
been
that
up
I don't,
there, or
I
possibly even
didn't.
Hong Kong. So yeah, during his military time, Hackman was stationed in China, in Qingdao, and later in Shanghai. And then when the communist
When you say
revolutionaries
Qingdao,
conquered,
do you mean Qingdao?
Qing, not so it's spelled differently to the beer.
Right. It's Qingdao though,
It is that is the same place, is it? Yeah.
because I lived there. I know.
Okay, well that's good. And then he only
Yeah.
moved out of there because of the communist revolution in
Oh,
1949 and was reassigned to Hawaii and Japan. So kind of it makes a lot of sense when he then gravitated to playing those kind of sort of grizzled, bullheaded military dudes in sort of
yeah.
later life in movies like sort of
Crimson
Crimson
Tide.
Tide.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Crimson Tide. Well, just real quick, let me start
yeah,
with my anecdote because although he's not my Uncle Gene, having the last name Hackman, especially the heydays when he was in the prime of his, French Connection. I remember as a young kid. Then he became Lex Luthor, which just catapulted him. He was everywhere, and so having the last name was kind of cool at the time. But my parents on their 10th wedding anniversary, I mean, this is many years ago now, in the 70s. They went to New York City. They'd never been to New York. I think I was about 8 years old. And the story they tell is there was a very high end restaurant that all was the place to be, and because it was a 10th anniversary, my dad made a reservation for them that evening, and so
okay.
they asked for his last name and his first initial, and he said Hackman G because his name's Gary Hackman, and they said, "Oh, of course, Mr. Hackman, we'll have a table for you," thinking it's Gene Hackman. And of course, when they arrived, they soon discovered it was Gary Hackman and not Gene Hackman. But they, nevertheless, they sat them in the area where they would tend to put their celebrities because this restaurant at the time drew a lot of celebrities. And so my mom and dad said they joked that on one side at the table next to them was Hal Linden, which is not a big deal now. Barney Miller was a big TV show in the 70s. Hal Linden was the star of that. So it was a big deal then. And they said Hal Linden was on our left and Doris Day was on our right. Oh, I'm sorry, not Doris Day, Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds was on our right. They met Debbie Reynolds, and the next day they went to go see her show and meet her backstage. So my dad's being able to be Gene Hackman for an evening got them in for a
That's
little
awesome.
backstage tour with Debbie Reynolds,
I
Carrie
do
Fisher's mother.
believe, yes, of course. And I do believe we have the same birthday, Debbie Reynolds and I.
Oh, okay.
I think we're both April Fools, if I remember rightly.
Mhm.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, if you can ride on the coattails of greatness, then do it. However you
Do it when you
can.
can, baby. Do it when you can.
Certainly after I heard the news, I was like, oh great, I've got to go rewatch some Gene Hackman
Yeah.
movies. And certainly when we agreed, okay, we'll talk about it. I ran to some, but there are so many. He's one of
Yeah.
those guys who's been around for so long and he's got his hit rate is so high. You know,
Mhm.
I was like, okay, well, I was kind of scrambling of where to go. And so I was just curious how you approached it and whether you wanted to single out, because I'm not even sure if I could do a top five because there are that many, or even a top 10 would be
Yeah.
painful, I think. So I'm curious, where did you start? What did you watch?
Yeah, I immediately watched the Poseidon Adventure. I'm going to say I'm not going to do a top five per se. I think
Mm,
I've got a few, just for the sake of time. We don't want to ramble, but movies of his that have really stuck with me, that were there, that I keep going back to, and some new ones, of course. For me, Poseidon Adventure. I know it is an Irwin Allen 70s disaster film, but the very fact you've got Gene Hackman, Ernest Borgnine, Shelley Winters, Roddy McDowall, Leslie Nielsen, there's just a who's who in
mm.
this film that raises it from being a little bit of a schlocky 70s disaster film like The Towering Inferno or Airport,
Whoa, 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 whoa,
to
whoa. Don't call those films schlocky. Come on. I mean, particularly
okay,
Towering
okay.
Inferno. Because
Okay,
this
they're not
was,
schlocky.
mm,
But it was a thing in the 70s where
yeah,
they would get these big casts and they would do these. So schlocky's the wrong word, but it's kind of a thing. We even have the Swarm where these bees would come up from South America and they would have this all-star cast that would. But
right.
the point being is, for me, the Poseidon Adventure, and I just rewatched it since Hackman died. And I was reminded how good of a film this is. And as a Christian minister myself, he plays a Christian minister who has deconstructed his faith. He's reevaluated some things. He's come out the other side, and he just has such a deeper appreciation for life. At one point, he says to Shelley Winters, trying to convince her to go up the Christmas tree to get to the top of the where Roddy McDowell is, and she feels she's too fat, she can't do it. She's just, feeling insecure, and he just says, "Up there is life, and life always matters. Let's go." And she's like, "Okay," But the way he says it, it's like, damn, I want to follow that. And I think maybe, I've said it before, but in the political times we're in, where there's a lot of mudslinging and there's a lot of the moral compass is a little shaky these days.
Yeah.
When film is a wonderful vehicle for reminding us where true north can be. And when I watched the Poseidon Adventure the other day, or when I watched Mississippi Burning, Hackman has a
Well, hang
unique
on.
ability.
Before you get
Sorry, go
into
ahead.
Mississippi Burning, I want to jump in because I knew you would want to talk about the Poseidon Adventure, and so
Okay.
because you had already said to me, before Gene Hackman died, even how important that movie was
Right.
to you and the
Mhm.
messages in that movie, and I think I had only seen it once, so actually when this all happened, that was the first movie that I sat down and rewatched. It was great. I'm really glad that I did rewatch it. I didn't remember much more than the broad strokes of of the narrative and just who was in it, and that was about it. But I was very, I mean, it's front and center, but I was very much aware of the kind of sort of the Christian element to it, and it is, and how much of the story really is propelled by this guy who has his flock who are somewhat reluctant to believe him, and how much of the story is about him just having to convince a rabble of people to follow him,
Yeah.
and that he is right, and that he can't prove it to them. They just have to believe him, and that it's all about him just, encouraging them to have faith in him and in his sort of not even knowledge, but in belief and in his leadership. And right until the end, Ernest Borgnine is just saying, "See, look what you did. You got it wrong. We
Yeah.
came all this way." It's a real kind of sort of Judas moment,
Yeah.
almost. Or not Judas, I suppose. Well, you could tell me who it would be,
Yeah.
Simon Peter or somebody. Moment where he throws it all back in his face. He's like, "Look what you convinced me to do, and I didn't." And I hadn't noticed, or I had forgotten quite how overt the whole religious allegory is in the movie, and how really the whole film is just one thing about the sort of the journey of a priest, or I suppose by extension of Jesus himself.
Yeah.
And it is all just about having faith and just believing when everything around you tells you otherwise. And
Wow. You
it
you've
was
really caught up in the faith aspect of this film, man. You're warming my heart. This is beautiful. I
or
mean,
it's
everything
just
you
incredibly
said.
unsubtle and on the nose. I mean, it's one of the two. So
Well, I actually, it's fairly subtle. And just to pick up on that, they have that wonderful relationship he has with the more mainstream minister, who
Mm,
still appreciates he still has a lot of respect for him. But it was interesting how that dichotomy and it's kind of what we're seeing with a lot of that old mainstream religion. It's like it's becoming a little bit less and less relevant. They're the ones who, hey, we just wait. We're just going to sit back and wait for somebody to rescue us. Somebody will eventually like my and even though that minister rather suspects they're all going to die if we stay
yeah,
here, he's going to tend his flock of people who don't have faith. And that's fine, but you can see kind of this, there's that evangelical versus that mainstream, and it's like, no, this is the right way to go. And if we want to live, we got to go this way. And
I like he
yeah,
even has
it's
to sort
just,
of contend with them, sort of saying, "Yeah, but everybody else is going the other way." Everybody else, he's
yes,
like, "Well,
yeah,
they're wrong.
yeah,
You have to believe
yeah,
me." And there's a version of them saying, "Well, what about that church that collapsed on all of those people?" There's a version of that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's a version of that argument. It's
yeah,
like, well,
yeah.
how do you explain the church that collapsed last week and killed 1,000 people and all of that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that happened in the
yeah,
Bible. That's what Jesus get hit. What he, that temple that fell down. Do you think they were any more deserving of it than anybody else? It's like basically Jesus saying, this side of heaven, shit happens. Like, don't
right.
be thinking that God's punishing you or that somehow your sin caused this to happen. It's just there was a faulty foundation and the building fell. That's it.
For sure. For sure. And I also appreciated just how many. I know this wasn't the first one of its kind. I mean, I think this came after Airport, but before Towering Inferno, I
Yes,
think. But
I think
how
so.
many of the kind of the tropes of the genre it lays down here? I mean, I love the fact that Leslie Nielsen is in this. I'd
Hmm.
forgotten that he was in this, and obviously, he goes on to parody that character or a version of that character in Airplane years later. But even things like the little kid who's been paying attention and has been bugging all of the
Yeah,
midshipmen and the engineers, and so to the point where he's the only one who knows the right route and the right way. I was like, oh well, these are the kids in Jurassic Park, and
yeah,
all those
yeah,
other things. It's like, okay, well, they're the nerds who have been reading all the books that no one else has got time to read, and then when push comes to shove, they're like, actually, we know how to do things properly. And
yeah.
and there were lots of other little bits like that along the way that I was just kind of like, oh, okay, all right, yeah, this is really sort of laying down the breadcrumbs, if you like, or laying down the tropes for this kind of movie, and I
And then
appreciated that.
and then Gene Hackman finishes with the Garden of Gethsemane moment. Like he knows he's got to go to the cross and he's got
Yeah.
to have his Lord, take this cup from me. But
And he's literally
okay,
hanging there,
he's just hanging, It's like the symbolism couldn't be more straightforward.
Sure.
And
Well,
of
because
course,
he has a pulpit moment early on as well, doesn't he? Because I think it's
yeah.
when he climbs up the tree first or something, and so he's up there and he's talking down to all the people, and it's very much a kind of sermon. He's just like, "Come on, you must follow me. This is the only way." And then you're right by the end, he's literally hanging there, and they're all gathered around underneath him, and he's like, "Okay, I haven't made it, but I am dying so that you can make it." It's kind of like,
Yeah.
all right, yep.
Yeah. Who else has done that before? Let me think about that for a
Yes,
minute.
exactly. I know this is reminding me of
This
something.
is
Yes.
something. But yeah, Poseidon Adventure obviously is probably my foundation movie for him. What about you, James? What would be your go-to Gene Hackman film?
Well, I think it is sort of that one-two punch of French Connection and The Conversation. And I didn't have time to rewatch The Conversation, and I was kind of frustrated that I didn't because that has particularly of late. I think it's just hit a major milestone anniversary. I think it's just had its 50th anniversary, and
Sounds
there's a
about
new
right.
restoration of it out there, and so people have been talking about it a lot more lately. But that was really cool because that's the Francis Ford Coppola movie between the two Godfather films that he made. And it's about a surveillance expert who thinks he overhears a murder plot, to kill the people that he's surveilling, if I remember rightly. And he just spirals into paranoia to the point where he kind of comes to believe that everybody is out to get him and that everybody is spying on him. And it's a really interesting film because in many ways it's sort of quite a small movie compared to those other two, which I'm sure was deliberate. It was something for Coppola to do as something of a palate cleanser in between those
Yeah.
two films, and it's a very unheroic kind of character. It's a very much a movie of its time. It's all about sort of paranoia and distrust and this kind of stuff. Right around the same time as the Parallax View and just before All the President's Men, and it came out the year after Watergate and all of this kind of stuff. So it was really feeding into so many of kind of the concerns and the anxieties of a nation at that time. But I just felt that for him it was a real sort of daring statement of a performance because it is so understated. It is just sort of like receding hairline, mustache, slightly schlubby, that he has no real sort of heroic qualities. And as the film goes on, he just gets sort of arguably more and more unlikable because he sort of shuts himself in and away from everybody else and ends up sort of tearing his entire apartment to pieces because he can't, he can't believe. Yeah, well, he's lost all faith and all trust in
Right.
the entire structure that surrounds him. But I think it was just kind of interesting for him to do it at that moment as well, because obviously he'd just won the Oscar, and actually, if I remember rightly, when he won the Oscar, he was in the middle of shooting the Poseidon Adventure, and there's a famous photograph of him celebrating with his Oscar, and he's surrounded by other cast members of the Poseidon Adventure with their Oscars, like Shelley Winters with hers, and one or two others with theirs, and you're kind of like, okay, must have been a nice moment for them. But so this was one of the first projects he took up, sort of in the wake of it, and
Right.
it premiered at Cannes where it won the Palme d'Or, which was really interesting, and it was actually the second year in a row that a Gene Hackman movie won the Palme d'Or. Because the previous year, a movie he did with Al Pacino, the only film he did with Al Pacino, called Scarecrow,
Scarecrow. Yeah,
also won
I've
the
never
Palme d'Or.
seen it. I want to watch. That's on my
This was
yeah.
the one I'd never seen that I wanted to watch, and I'm glad you hadn't watched it either because it's the one I didn't get to that I was straight away I was like, oh, finally I'm going to watch Scarecrow now, and then I just didn't get to it. But yeah, so The Conversation, I just absolutely love it, and so that 1-2 of French Connection and The Conversation for me just sort of solidified like this is who he is, and just because that period, sort of the early 70s, new American kind of cinema,
Yeah.
was really where I sort of zeroed in on first as a film student at university.
I love the films of like 69 to about 75. They're just fantastic. And the reason Scarecrow's on my radar, besides, us just talking about it,
Mm.
is I have been watching YouTube interviews with Gene Hackman the last week, or little clips and people giving their memorials or when they worked with them. There's a lovely one with Kevin Costner when he worked with them on No Way Out that I watched. It's worth watching. But he was on David Letterman in 19 probably 86, something like that. And they were asking about his favorite movies. He said, it's been a lot. And this was in 86. He still had a lot more to go.
Sure.
But he said probably the movie didn't do that well, but probably the one I enjoyed working on the most was Scarecrow with Al Pacino. And I thought, shoot, I haven't seen that. That's got to go to the top of the list now.
Yeah, I keep kicking myself that I've still not got around to watch it because it was from that period. I've been sort of aware of it this whole
Hmm.
time, ever
Yeah.
since I was a teenager and I was watching The Godfather for the first time. I was watching French Connection for the first time. There was like this moment, and something about it just didn't sound as exciting off the,
Hmm.
from the
Yeah.
jump, and then it's always just been on the pile and just been like, okay, yeah, I'll get to it, I'll get to it, I'll
Yeah.
get to it, and here I am all these years later, and I still haven't got to it yet. But yeah, I mean, you talk about 86, he had so many films under his belt. I mean, the 80s and the 90s were such prolific periods for
Oh, he
him.
did huge amounts. I mean, after, he had Crimson Tide, he had The Firm with Tom
Hmm.
Cruise. As we mentioned before, Get Shorty with John Travolta.
Yeah, I think it was after, it's probably all kick-started by his second Oscar win for Unforgiven in 92.
Yes. Which I
Which is
just rewatched yesterday. I rewatched that yesterday.
see, I was gonna watch that, which obviously I've seen many times. But then another one popped up, The Quick and the Dead, the Sam Raimi Western with Sharon Stone
Mm.
that I and Leonardo DiCaprio that I had never seen, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to watch that one instead because it's clearly a kind of similar character, and it was a couple of years later, so he was like, okay, cha-ching, I can just cash in on this newfound success. I'm at that stage of the career now, of my career now, where I'm not playing the lead anymore. I'm playing the heavy. I'm playing the villain.
Right.
I'm a little bit older than the lead, and I just get to ham it up and be the bad guy. And so that's where he did this run from Forgiven. You've got, The Firm, there, Quick and the Dead, Crimson Tide, Get Shorty, like you said. Basically for the rest of his career, he's either going to be the stuffy straight man or he's going to be the bad guy from now
Yeah.
on.
Royal
And
Tenenbaums,
but that for me, I mean, it feels like I know it wasn't his final role, but that kind of feels like the role you want to go out on,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
It does feel like sort of the culmination of everything. And I mean, it was only what 1 or 2 years later that he did retire, but that was probably his last great performance, I would say.
I saw Bill Murray talking about working with him on Royal Tenenbaums, and this is after his death. So
Mm.
it has that connotation that he's sharing this anecdote, where he said actually Gene Hackman didn't like working on that movie. He was irritable. He said, to be fair, Wes Anderson has his style.
Mm.
Obviously, Gene's this titan of, so you have two guys on set, and then he said, to be fair, they had Gene working with children, working in like environments that were not conducive. They were not fun environments to work in. And you could just see him getting an irrit. And a couple times he just goes, "What the hell am I doing here? Like, what the hell am I?"
Well, because I guess by that stage, Royal Tenenbaums, I mean, in a way, it was Royal Tenenbaums was the film that really established Wes Anderson as an
Yeah,
auteur in Hollywood. Because he'd done two films before that. He'd done Bottle Rocket and then Rushmore. And Rushmore's the one that popped up on my radar. And that was the film that really proved to the world that Bill Murray could do something other than comedy, really. He'd done
right.
like little flirtations with it in the past, but that was the one. He won a Golden Globe for it, I think. And so Royal Tenenbaums was kind of the first of these big star-studded ensembles that Wes Anderson then went on just to always do. And so it's understandable that somebody like Gene Hackman, very much sort of a product of the studio system, or who had become accustomed to the studio system through the 80s and 90s, even if it started out in something a bit more rough and ready, that, yeah, I'm sure he had a very comfortable way of working sort of in the
Mhm.
90s, particularly where he just comes in, he acts a bit gruff, shouts his lines at Tom Cruise or whomever, and then goes to lunch. And this was very different. I mean, he's wearing silly makeup from his perspective, silly makeup, silly
Hmm.
costumes on silly sets with all of these like indie kids, these brats,
Yeah.
this second generation, and then kids on top of that. He's playing very much the patriarch of a bigger, younger generation of like Ben Stiller and Gwyneth Paltrow. And yes, you've got Bill Murray there, but I'm sure they didn't necessarily click. And so I can completely understand that he would step in and be just like, "What the hell is this? Why am I
Yeah.
doing this?" And probably have a short thrift with with Anderson's eccentricities. So yeah, I give him that. I mean, one thing I did want to flag up from the '90s very quickly. It isn't what I'm about to say, but over time, people have come to interpret "Enemy of the State." The Tony
Hmm.
Scott movie with Will Smith in it, that his character from the Enemy of the State is the same character from The Conversation,
Conversation. Yeah.
and that it's kind of like a spiritual sequel. And you're kind of like, well, sure. And I'm sure when the casting director suggested Gene Hackman, they're like, oh, that would be funny. Yeah, because
Hmm.
one could
Yeah.
surmise that this might be what happened to that character, Harry. I can't remember what his name is, Harry something. 20 odd years later. But I wanted to try and find the time to actually watch them as a double bill and just see if there's any real.
Connection points. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's not the case. I know it's not.
Yeah.
It's not a sequel, but if to see how strongly it works. But because that was another really big one that he did in the '90s, surprisingly
Yeah.
successful. I think people always forget how successful that movie was.
I think another one I probably just want to highlight, and this will probably wrap it up for me, is
Hmm.
because we could just go on for another hour and a
Of course,
half
he's
about
done
his
that
films.
many. Yeah, yeah.
Is I just rewatched Hoosiers, and Hoosiers. I'm not even a basketball fan, and this movie is incredible. I love it. Yes, he does get the girl, he does get Barbara Hershey, but it's not a romance film. It is just middle America boys basketball. I didn't realize it's based on a true story. Again, watching Gene Hackman in interviews the last week, him saying that Hoosiers was based on a real life story, I guess in 1954, this little town of 400 people in Indiana, the high school there went all the way to the state champions in this Cinderella story. And that's what the film was based
Mm.
on. And so, yeah,
Yeah, well, Hoosiers is the other one that you pushed me without knowing
yeah.
that you pushed me to watch that I had never seen. To the best of my knowledge, I'd never seen it. I mean, who knows? It
Oh,
was probably on TV in the '80s, and I may have
sure,
sat in front
sure.
of it. And so I watched that for the first time last
Oh,
week
really? I didn't
as well. I did.
realize. So,
I
what did you
did.
think?
Um, I think it's an '80s basketball movie. I mean, no, it's
Yeah,
great. It is
yeah,
great, and I mean, I'm surprised to see that it ranks quite so highly on so many people's lists of like one of the best sports movies of all time.
yeah.
But it is really good. I mean, all I knew about it is that Dennis Hopper plays the drunk and got his only Oscar nomination for it.
It's the redemption story in it too, you know? It's
Yeah, and I
just,
I
yeah,
did choke up from that relationship between him and his son on the team.
yeah.
Actually, there are a couple of moments when his son finally kind of accepts him and listens to him and says, "Okay, we're going to do things." And then right at the end, when they do the picket fence move, and I was going to go, "No, you're crying. It's fine." So there were a couple of moments, and yeah, I liked the period setting. Although in hindsight, that does kind of make it feel a little bit Dead Poet Society esque,
Yes, yeah,
even though this was made a year or two before Dead Poet Society. But yeah, I really liked it. I think going in, I didn't know it was a period piece. I
yeah.
just knew it was small town basketball movie.
It's interesting when those 80s movies start too, and it starts with that synthesizer dong. You know, it's like it sets an establishment shot, like the cornfields and
Yeah,
Hoosiers
one
or
car
New
drives
York
by.
City. It would be like New York, and there's always that synthesizer dong, you know, and it's like that electronica music, and you immediately know, okay, this is 1986, 1987.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, you got to remember, obviously, back in the '80s, they really were fetishizing the '50s as much as possible. It was just,
Yes,
it's that generational thing, the way that so many filmmakers these days are fetishizing the '80s and the '90s.
80s, yeah,
But
yeah,
I think it's just because it's like, oh, Back to the Future being a huge example of that. So yeah, that was great. I watched that for the first time, and yes, did also read that it was based on a true story. Although apparently, although that bit pretty much exactly happened the way it happened, it wasn't quite as much of a surprise. Apparently, the team was already pretty good, even though they
Oh yeah,
were
yeah,
this tiny team from a small sort of farming town
yeah.
in the middle of, where was it, Kansas or wherever they were.
Indiana.
Indiana, yes, the Hoosier state. Okay, sorry. But apparently it wasn't quite as much of a surprise, and that they actually did come into that season quite a formidable threat already. And you're like, okay. The only other one I want to tip my cap to very, very, very quickly, because it is really sort of an unsung movie, I think, is Bat 21. I don't know if you know this
Oh,
movie.
I'm familiar with it. I have not seen it.
Yeah, it's a weird movie for me because I'm not sure exactly why, but for some reason, it's a movie I ended up with a VHS copy of. I think maybe someone had left me a bunch of VHSs, and that was one on the part. And so I ended up watching it a lot when I was quite young, because it's from '88. So probably, yeah, in the late '80s, early '90s, I kind of watched it quite a lot, and it's set I think during Vietnam, and he's a colonel. He's far too senior to be in the field, and
Hmm.
his plane crashes or something, and so he's stuck behind enemy lines in Vietnam. And Danny Glover plays like a radio plane pilot who has to keep kind of circling around, as the only person he can contact, and has to kind of guide him home. And so it's just a one man stuck behind enemy lines kind of movie, probably made
Right.
in the aftermath of Rambo or something like that. Really, missing in action. It's just like get our man home kind of thing. But I just remember really, really sort of enjoying it, and watching it a whole bunch of times. And that was kind of one of the big Gene Hackman performances for me as a young moviegoer. And I think, again, that's quite possibly why they cast him in that movie. I think it's called Behind Enemy Lines, isn't it, with Owen Wilson,
Yeah, yeah,
where
yes,
he's the older guy,
yeah,
shepherding in the younger guy. But so that's one I've been meaning to rewatch, just to see if it's actually any good or not, because it was
yeah.
a movie I rewatched at an age when I wasn't really able to tell whether it was any good or not. So
We would be remiss though if we don't mention Bonnie and Clyde.
sure, sure,
Because
yeah.
I mean, obviously that was probably the film that put him on the map. I'm trying to think if there was a film earlier than that, but did
Not
he get
really.
an Oscar for Bonnie and Clyde?
He got an Oscar nomination. Yeah. So by the
Right.
time it was really early on, so by the time he won for French Connection in 1971, although he hadn't been in that many movies, it was already like his third Oscar nomination, which was
Mhm.
pretty crazy.
So I didn't want us to go through this whole retrospective, and some listener out there is going, "How could they not mention Bonnie and Clyde?" Of
Mm.
course, we have to mention Bonnie and Clyde.
And there are plenty of other movies we haven't mentioned as well. Trust me, we have a list of his movies in front of us, so we
Yeah, yeah.
know. It's just like you said earlier, we're not going to sit here and talk just list off his movies and say, yeah, that one's good, that one's not so good, that one's really good.
So I am definitely going to give a little more intention. He is definitely one of my top five favorite actors of all time. His movies, I can't think of many actors I would put above him. And so, obviously the film industry has lost a titan with Gene Hackman, but he'd been off. He hadn't made a movie in about 15 years, I don't think. He's been, I think,
2004 was his last one,
Welcome to
so
Mooseport, I think was his last film.
yeah, which I haven't seen,
I think I saw it once when it came out. Probably, I heard it's not bad. I need
with
to go
Ray
back and
Romano.
rewatch it.
I don't think I saw it, but yeah,
Yeah,
he is definitely one of those guys. The
yeah,
He's always been there. I think because of movies
yeah.
like Superman, and because of movies like The French Connection, he's just always been in the ether and around. Whether you're paying close
Mhm.
attention to cinema or not, everybody's like, "Oh yeah, 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 I know that guy." Of course, he's been in loads of
Yeah,
stuff, and that's the
yeah,
truth, is that he has been in
yeah.
absolutely loads of stuff. So I will continue
Well, that's
even after this conversation to
good.
to explore his and revisit his back catalog, just because I do organically anyway, just because he's in so many
Yeah,
good
same,
movies.
same. It's just, sadly, when a situation like this or incident, passing comes along, it causes us to really look at his back catalog and go, "Oh gosh, I gotta watch that." So. Well, that's what James and I have to say about the late great Gene Hackman. As I said, we have lost just a mammoth actor. Mammoth? Titan. I thought I used Titan twice, so I didn't want to use the same word.
He's a mammoth actor, sure, why not?
And we've listed off a number of films that have been meaningful to us. They just come to the top of our head, and we have anecdotes, either films that go way back in our film loving history or ones that we have just saw for the first time. Immense and really, yeah, I'm tired. But what say you? What didn't we mention? What is your favorite Gene Hackman film, James?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he is one of those actors where he has done so much stuff, and his filmography is so vast and wide, from Superman to The Birdcage to
The Birdcage. I forgot about the
yeah, well,
Birdcage.
exactly. And
Yes.
that's fine, and that's the point. He is the
Yes.
gift that keeps on giving. We could just sit here and talk about his movies all night, but we have to draw this to a close. So yeah, what are some of your favorites? And why? And if you've got any anecdotes, share them with us. And yeah, if there are any that you would like us to go into a deep dive on, by all means, you can
You
request.
ought to
Till
be
next
in
episode.
Bye bye.
pictures. You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be. Your